I need to be able to help myself first before I can be more effective in serving others, right?
They went so deep into minimum standards that they were looking at the privatization of maternity cover in the US and then assessing it against the NHS provision in the UK.
Just because you're a leadership doesn't mean that is not going to be impactful to you, right?
It's not necessarily doing more, it's doing things differently. The moment that you approach this from a checklist standpoint, to me, you're a shopper. Yeah. You're not a strategist.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Friends with Benefits podcast. I'm Carl, a VP of Benefit Design and Partnerships, and joined by my co-host David.
I'm David, one of the founders here at Ben, and really excited for the conversation today. Today we have Lee Cortez. Thanks for joining us. It should be a fun conversation. I figured maybe we can just start with a quick introduction, right, of your background and the things that you've done. That'd be a good place to start.
Absolutely. It's good to be here. I think it's a really cool space that you have created for everyone to have a conversation and dialogue. So it's really interesting. You know that feeling when you have the sensation you're a lot younger than you actually are, and then you're like, oh, no. I've been working for 20 years, so I've been having a lot of that sensation as of recent. So that got me really reflecting around, like, okay, what is the common thread or theme, throughout my work life or career? And it really began with just this belief and desire to impact people. And so that led me to my first job out of uni, doing benefits consulting. Back then they call it human capital consulting, and then employee benefits was a component of that, right? And so specialized in healthcare benefits, and then later on all of the different types of pension schemes like 401k and all of the more traditional pension schemes that were sunsetted around that era. So that was really good in terms of getting my grounding and foundation. And then after a couple of years of doing that, I thought, gosh, I want to really lean into a bit more of my people impact, right? To do that more directly. So I decided to go to social work school. So I got my master's in social work. And
a bit different than benefits.
Very different, but they're very connected. And so that was interesting. So my placements to get my training hours where one was on Rikers Island Corrections Facility. So counseling young men and preparing them for re-entering our communities. Wow. And then for my second year, I worked for a think tank, an academic think tank that does applied academic research. So our research focused on preparing foster youth in terms of career programming so that when they exit the foster care system, that they are as enabled as they can be. So then you avoid this revolving cycle of poverty, like incarceration or single parenthood, etc. And so that was when I started to really zero in on the workplace or the value and meaning of work in terms of actually is serving as a protective factor for people. Right. So my first job out of social work school was managing New York City's workforce development program. So that was really neat in terms of working with really the working class, sometimes the working poor, a lot of times the working poor, and connecting them to job opportunities, right? And then for them to be able to support their families, et cetera. So really loved that job. Unfortunately, I was saddled with student loans. So I thought, wait a minute, I need to be able to help myself first before I could be more effective in serving others, right? So then I pivoted back to benefits. I landed a more senior role at Aon. And then the specialism was different from US benefits. It was international benefits. I thought, that's nice. I'm returning to something that's similar to what I was doing before social work school, but then offered me a little bit more room to grow as well. And so within that space, I ended up working for Aon and then eventually Mercer. I worked on a lot of M&A and spin-outs or divestitures. Yeah. And so I developed this very niche expertise around having the knowledge of US and non-US benefits, but also how to do that for companies that are spinning out or companies that are being acquired. So that specialism is actually what made me attractive to this recruiter on LinkedIn who recruited me to work at Google. And so they were doing their alphabetization exercise where they were spinning out companies out of Google.
Yeah. Good point.
And then so I was a Google employee dedicated to standing up and determining what would be the benefit strategy for these firms that were spinning out of Google. Google was so well known for their benefits, right? So how do you actually provide that continuity and encourage people to stay on as they were spinning out of the world that they've gotten to know? And so a couple of years of doing that, and then an opportunity came up in London to be a benefits manager here, which was really the direct equivalent on the client side of who I was consulting for when I was in consulting.
Right.
Pursued that, also thought can't ever really go wrong with having international experience, whether that's professionally or personally.
Yeah.
So I pursued that. And then from Google, I went to Okta, leading their international benefits team. And then from there, an opportunity came up with Block. I've always loved Square as a product. I thought it was really
great
innovative, right?
Yeah.
I've always admired it. And then I wasn't necessarily looking to change because, there's change fatigue is also very real. But I really love how Block talks about economic empowerment as their mission. And I really identified with that with my social work background, having identified the value of work in enabling people and people's lives. So I ended up pursuing that. And from there, I then landed an opportunity eventually to lead up the entire global benefits function, which also includes mobility and immigration. So throughout my career, I'd say when I reflect on it, there was a moment in time that I thought, gosh, I'm not using my social work training. But then in talking with friends and, peers, I made the connection that actually, if I'm using my first principles of human-centeredness, equity, fairness, I'm able to apply and mold policies and programs with the same sets of values that matter to me personally and professionally. So that when I had that aha moment, it really gave me this lifeline to press on within the benefit space. Yeah. And so that's how I really see it. And
amazing.
And then being really good, and it's an ongoing process to, of course, always making sure that there's a business element to it, right? That's a part of the narrative. And so, I'd say that's me. I recently, as you know, completed my executive MBA from Cambridge, and I really just did that I did that as a way to round out my skills and my leadership, but also to go out there and kind of see through what professionals like me can do in spaces like that. So I quite like that. And I want to do just a quick disclaimer, right? Everything that I'm sharing here is my own opinions, does not represent past, future, present employer.
Yeah.
But it's good to be
important. And amazing background, right? So you've seen a lot, you've done a lot of energy things. And I think it's one of the things that we sometimes forget as well. I think most people kind of can fall into benefits. And then, at the end of the day, we are having huge impact on people's lives, right?
Absolutely.
Whether it's health, wealth, like everything. And it's so easy to kind of get bogged down into the details of, administration when it's something that I have to constantly remind myself as well. I guess one of the things we wanted to do in terms of, before we got into the meat and potatoes of the conversation is we always like to do this sort of segment around in the news recently.
Yeah.
And so there's been an article in the Times kind of highlighting how, especially in financial services sectors, is lagging behind, right? Particularly in gender representation at the leadership level, and turnover for women in the sector is particularly high. So I guess from your perspective, actually working in the financial services sector with Block, which is more technology, but even so, right, anything that you can think through in terms of policies or things that you're putting in place to help to do that from a benefits or rewards point of view?
I think for anyone who's listening to this conversation, right, or if you have any connections to friends with family members who are raising a child, you can immediately calculate the ROI of staying at home or paying for childcare, right? So when those types of support structures are unavailable at work, from a very practical basis, it does not make sense. It may not make any sense for an individual to actually continue and press on with work, right? And also you can't really quantify the value that you would have with a child, right? So I'm making a connection here around the caregiving element potentially for women, right? To be able to have a child and be with a child. So when those types of policies are not designed in a way that actually thinks about or consider their needs, there isn't a whole lot of play to convince an employee to stay. And then that affects their leadership potential, right? There's also this element around when women return to work, they're returning at least, not my lived experience, right? But I would imagine that they return with a new form of identity. Mm-hmm. So how well is a workplace actually integrating and honoring their new identity and designing programs and experiences that allow them to honor that identity, but also recognize that they have a new set of responsibilities outside of work. Mm-hmm. When you don't have those support structures or thoughtfulness and how you consider that, it makes the workplace the goodness of fit of that environment becomes compromised. Mm. So then the impetus to maybe then considering whether you stay on or you continue on is a real consideration. I am surprised to hear about this because at least several years back, a professional services firm have been lauded actually for being more advanced in this space. I think when we were designing benefits in Mercer, but it's a resounding message as well that if you're not keeping up with the times and in the life course of individuals, people are maturing, right? And they have different needs, then you could easily fall behind and not offer the right set of solutions that are actually most pertinent to the life stage of any employees that you have.
It is interesting because I think there was a study recently about firms in the US that were, and this is at a leadership level, led by females, like outperforming male-led organisations at quite a significant ratio. I always wonder whether this sort of comes back to the broader societal piece around primary caregivers. Right? So the female is automatically assumed to be the primary caregiver. Is that as a result of pay equity? Is that as a result of the maternal relationship being more important than the paternal one in the raising of children? I guess all of these things are considerations as well, aren't they? In that sort of thought experiment you're running.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, what was interesting there is just talking through it impacts at all the levels, right? So just because you're a leadership doesn't mean that is not going to be impactful to you, right? So and then how do you develop from the base up towards? Because obviously, if you don't have the support structures internally, a lot of leaders are developed internally, right? So if you don't have that, then it becomes a huge issue. So
I'll add into what you mentioned earlier as well. It's not sometimes it's easy to get hung up on the what is being offered and not thinking necessarily about the how it's offered, right? So taking the parental leave, for example, it's often the immediate thinking is how many weeks are you provided on a paid basis, right? The how mentality or mindset would be more around how do you define a caregiver? And are you subsequently and intentionally reinforcing stereotypes that may actually not be relevant to the way our workforce actually looks and feels these days, right? So a parental leave that is reinforcing that mothers are the primary caregiver may not actually be true, right? Or not, it's not actually necessarily true this day and age.
Yeah. And I certainly there's more and more companies now as well, certainly in the UK, that are offering quite significant packages in terms of paternal leave, like I think companies like Aviva, for example, are offering like 26 weeks of paternity cover, So I guess for females, then when when the paternal father is at home, then
it should make it easier.
It should make it easier. They're staying in touch. I guess all of these things. I guess makes it easier.
So I think the first area that we want to dive into is obviously you're super passionate about inclusivity, right, and inclusive benefits. We really wanted to understand from your perspective, what does it actually mean, right? It's one of these words that get thrown around, inclusivity, but what does it mean to design benefits that are inclusive and equitable? And I guess where do companies get it right and wrong?
I'd say I really hate the word passion, I have to say, because it carries a different kind of cachet that you're passionate about something, and that's often it's perceived as not being grounded in science or art, right?
Actually.
And so in terms of equity and inclusion, I think of it as a set of more holistic way of thinking about a problem set, right? Often when it doesn't work is when it's seen as a list of things, tick boxes of if we have X, Y, Z, then it's supporting diverse populations, right? And so having those types of assumptions, I think, is quite unproductive, and it doesn't help build a business case towards truly more inclusive design. And so the way I think about it is going beyond benchmarks. So often, you'll know this from the consulting days, you start with, or often you lead with benchmarks. If you think about benchmarks, it's an average, right?
Yeah.
And people with marginal needs are, by definition, living at the margins. So they're not informing the average. So there's a flaw to the average. So that's one way I'd say, if we can defy that logic or the need, it's good to know and sense check what's happening around you. But what is it that you really care about from a first principles perspective as an organization? And how then do you realize that, right? It should be a constellation of considerations, right? It's benchmarking, it's values, it's first principles. And that, to me, is a healthy way to start the conversation around inclusive design.
When you sort of talk about inclusivity, then, I mean, you think about things like sort of where do people differ? You know, like, so you've got gender, you've got age, you've got ethnicity, but you can take that down to the nth degree, can't you? And if you take it right down to core principles, everyone's completely different. We all have different wants, needs, fears, desires, concerns. So, I mean, where do you draw the line in terms of what you're trying to establish, what you're trying to achieve with inclusive policies and taking that principle of inclusivity?
It's understanding that there's a lot of presuppositions as well when we say this is what it means to be inclusive. So the way I would redefine it is actually understanding the needs of your employees, right? Because it could look different depending on your population mix. Right. I think generally speaking, we know what inclusion or diversity might look like from a protective class definition per statutory rules, right? But there's a lot more to people in terms of their lived experiences and lived reality that you really will only uncover if you ask them, right? So building the definition from the ground up, I think, is a really good place to start. It's good to have a general understanding what those are. It's more powerful when you can corroborate that with, well, I think I have a starting point on what inclusion might mean and how that might translate into programming and design. But what does it mean specifically for my workforce? So ask them, so either employee surveys, right? Or working with your employee resource groups or ERGs or affinity groups. Let's call them ERG for this conversation. It's a mouthful. And so asking them directly, what is it that you need, right? And then from there, you can start defining a more robust problem statement, because that's really essential when you're building a business case for these things. These cost money, right? So you have to be able to demonstrate ROI and relevance to your population. And when you can make those connections, then you start pulling the threads of retention tool, right? Attraction, candidate attraction, talent attraction. So it's compiling all of these elements together and coming up with a cohesive narrative or cohesive definition, right? And a narrative that supports the need to pursue these programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also have a pretty opinionated view on benchmarking, I think.
Yes.
In the sense that, as you were saying, and also the definition of inclusivity, because somebody else in a different industry is doing it doesn't mean that is right for you, right? Correct. Like if you're in financial services, because every other financial organization is doing this, it doesn't mean that you should do it, because your population might look completely different or have totally different needs, right? Yeah. So it's a bit of a flawed way of thinking, but I guess it's the easiest way to go to a leadership and be like, look, this company is doing this, like we are out of match, we should be doing the same. I guess what else, like other things that you've seen being successful when making the case for sort of inclusive design internally that goes beyond the benchmark? Yeah,
besides understanding the needs of your population.
Or just as in, how do you make the case for it? So like understanding the needs of the population, I get it. And then sort of coming up with that narrative. But then to your point, like how do you prove the ROI to say like, hey, this is something that we need to do? I found that a lot of people that I talk to at least struggle with quite a lot with that question.
It's a struggle, because one thing that I really want to put out there is asking ourselves, what is also the moral obligation of an organization in terms of fulfilling whatever that gap is, right? So to answer that question, so some of these are quite philosophical and conceptual, but I'd love to walk through these concepts or ideas. One is having a shared language, right? Often people confuse equality and equity. Equality is providing something that's same. Equity is recognizing that people have different starting points. And for something to be quite effective, you need to provide potentially differentiated levels of support, right? So taking, again, what we've discussed already, parental leave. In the US, aren't necessarily protections, or at least paid protections. So the need is different versus maybe in the UK where you get X number of weeks on a partially paid basis. So then if you're designing benefits or policies around that, then your cost bases are looking different. So if you're approaching it from a lens of everyone gets the same, then you're not actually optimizing for the need, but also the spend. So the moment that you could tease out those levels of nuances and differences, then you're also more effective. It brings you, it gives you a little bit more credence and credibility when you're having those conversations, that you're not just applying a blanket approach, right? So I think that's also really important, being able to tease out the differences between what equality means, what equity means, driving everyone or helping everyone to understand that and how that actually transforms the design. There also is a broader situation, I'd say, that often across benefits, I notice that you just you get a diverse set of profiles that do benefit work. And so there is a need for a baseline understanding of benefit staff, right? And whether that's technical competencies or design, right? Because when you're good at that stuff, you optimize for a lot of bad spend. And when you do that, then you can easily say, let's reallocate that money. Or one angle that you could approach designing for further inclusion, right? For inclusive benefits that may not exist yet, is to say that this isn't necessarily, it's net new, but it's also pulling away from the cost savings because we're diligent and we're disciplined with how we've approached benefits management in general.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think a lot of companies do, I think, take that approach that equity to them is just providing the same thing to everyone. And I think there's also this element of when you sort of try and build diversity into benefits as well, that it's seen as a hygiene factor, a tick box exercise. You're seeing companies introducing assisted reproduction plans, transgender plans, and it's almost like, right, we've done that now, we've parked that. And it's just, there's so much more to this, isn't there? And so much, it's not just benefits, it's policies, it's the whole company and how it operates, isn't it? That builds into this. I don't see that many companies going that deep into it, and I don't know why. I don't know if you, like, when you joined Block, was that part of the sort of the reason for joining, to really lean into that? Are they a company that leans into that, or and do you have any sort of thoughts on why companies take more of a sort of hygiene factor to this?
It's lack of awareness. I'd say it's seeing benefits in this really traditional construct. I'd love for more people, or to hear more people thinking of it as a method through which you could not only deliver benefits, but it is a strategic tool for talent attraction, retention.
Totally.
It's a way for you to realize your inclusion and diversity objectives, right, through thoughtful design, because that's what diversity, equity, inclusion is all about, right? It's changing the fundamental structure and ensuring that those are founded on these first principles. And then when you do that, then the programs and the outputs are inclusive, equitable, and fair, and supportive of a diverse community. So to me, it's one of my mentors actually, she explained it quite well when she said, when you are solving for these types of needs, it's not necessarily about doing more, but it's doing things differently. Thinking of ways that you could reimagine something and mold your actions and your outputs towards this new construct, right? So I think that there's an element of education around how to think about benefits. So knowledge and awareness. It's also, and again, to me, a lot of my own knowledge and the designing for inclusion came from the communities themselves. So find a way that you have regular cadence or an engagement framework with your ERGs where you can get this feedback, right? And then it's also a conversation, right? Because some of the things that I've heard from in the past is some cultures, for example, really value their relationship with their families and their parents. So they'd love to be able to cover them under their insurances, right? But the reality is only a few select markets allow that, right? India and Singapore, Philippines come to mind. And so when you connect with them, it's also a point to, it's also an opportunity to get them educated on it, right? Because part of inclusive design isn't just the output, it's the process and the fairness in that process. When you're saying, I'm getting inputs and I'm able to tell them what's feasible versus what's not, even though the outcome isn't the ask, the fact that you had that conversation and the fact that you demonstrated the reason of why or why not, to me, that's a fair process. It's fair design, right?
Yeah. Which kind of naturally takes us on to the sort of next topic, really, around sort of building practical steps to building benefits that are inclusive. And I think you kind of answered this, but the first piece around, what are the key steps for designing inclusive benefits? I've always sort of raised it there, that piece around feasibility, right? So what can you actually do? Does the market play ball with what you're trying to achieve? And you're right, in some markets you can, in some markets you can't.
You can, yeah.
How do you then sort of cross the T's and dot the I's around equity if you're offering different things in different markets based on capability? Does that then not create an argument the other way that you're not solving the problem at all because you're only offering you're creating non-equity in the organization?
I suppose the first step is to really understand what the different market needs, right? Sure. From a statutory perspective, from a trend perspective. What I noticed, what I know from doing international non-US benefits work is people outside of the US really know their entitlement. They know what protections they have. They know they have an expectation. For example, if you're working in Japan, employees in the tech industry know that there are premier health insurance associations for tech companies. They will know that, right? So one way to think about this is understand your global minimums.
Yep.
And your global minimums are informed by your company priorities, your values, right? So actually, I'll take a step back. It's really important to understand the broader strategy of the business and how the people in HR strategy feeds into that.
I think a lot of people miss that. It's like they just go straight into the benefits design without thinking like, hey, here's where the company is, here's where it's going. And
then how does your functional strategy help with that? To be fair, a lot of people miss that because often organizations are not, the hygiene around that isn't as strong, right? But that's really the ideal state.
Yeah.
And then once you know that, you think about what set of priorities and how you approach the work to support that. And then that helps with the business case development as well, right? In terms of your question, I would say you can think of it as tiers, right? So what are our global minimums and what informs our global minimums? Then you look at each market and say, well, what does that market need? Like, what is it that if we're missing it, it would stick out to as an odd thing to a local employee, and then be able to design around that. Now, suggesting here as well is you will have trade-offs. So the more nuanced you are with your design, you could be compromising scale, right? And so that's probably where solutions like yours is really handy, right? Because you're able to solve for that, right?
Yeah.
But that to me is the ideal state. If you're able to compromise, you have your baseline what you stand for, and then you overlay that with the local needs is quite important. Then you also can think about what is that design element that actually cuts across the organization, and I think that's where global minimums, can solve for that.
Yeah.
Those are my general thoughts.
Global minimums, mate. Yeah. So I did. Obviously, I'm ex-Mercer as well. So I did this project for a company that remained nameless, but they went so deep into minimum standards that they were looking at the privatisation of maternity cover in the US and then assessing it against the NHS provision in the UK to determine whether it was, comparable, and actually looking at can they privatise maternity services in the UK to bring it up to a standard equivalent to what their US colleagues were getting. That's how deep they were going with it, which is. But and I guess that proves the point that you can go super deep with this, can't you? Right? But I guess just starting with the best intentions is probably the right place to.
Oh, I love that. What this reminds me of then is asking the fundamental question when you're determining your global minimums around, well, what is it that we're solving for?
Yeah.
Because to me, when I hear that, it's solving for an assumed market failure,
Yeah.
right? But that's also coming from a lens of an US American thinking that this is a market failure. But when you localize that in the UK context, imperfections and all, NHS provides a deeper level of healthcare access than any type of
if you don't have good health insurance.
Exactly, it's attached to your employment, right? So it's also asking ourselves who's the source of that suggestion. I think that's important in the design conversation, inclusive design conversation. You have to have not just racially or ethnically diverse, but diversity in terms of cognitive background, academic background, lived experiences, life experiences. Those all come into play, right? And so how do you create, it becomes more of a philosophical, soul-searching question around how do you create space in that design? Because if I were in that design session, I would say, well, I think that's an American lens, and we're applying, making an assumption that this is bad, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm not entirely sure what problem we're trying to solve here with this.
I guess one thing that you mentioned was the scale bit, right? So like when people, I know you mentioned it a couple of times yourself, right? When people think about inclusivity, they'll be like, oh, we have to be doing more, right? Because we need to be doing more around it. But you said it was about thinking things differently. So how do you, I guess, how do you square that circle, right? Like how do you think about scale within that as well? Because the more scale you have, I guess like the more challenging it's going to be to design for inclusivity.
The ideal state is, you have all of the structures in place.
What do you mean by that? Like the structure?
You have your support systems through benefit operations, right? You have your tech infrastructure also sorted, and you're with a partner that can, be flexible. Your integrations are taking place. When you solve for those things, a lot of automation takes place, right? And there's an opportunity here around how AI can actually support with these types of needs as well. Now that's the ideal state, and across the different organizations that I've worked for, and the different clients that I've also seen in consulting, that's not often the case, right? So the way I think about, from a design point of view, how you could actually scale is to solve for as many needs as you can with your design. So this is where the lens of intersections come into play. There will be needs that will cut across different employee populations. I'll take a really easy example around financial inclusion, financial health, right? You know that suggestive of the article, women are potentially disproportionately impacted in terms of career opportunities. You can translate that to savings rate, right? So when you think of enhancing or amplifying your retirement benefits, for example, you could position that as meeting a need, even if the community isn't positioning it as such. Already that you're impacting diversity through that, right? But we also know, for example, in the United States, that because there wasn't any civil rights provisions, right, that protected people from things like employment discrimination, people from the BAME or BIPOC plus community in the States really haven't had the same wealth accumulation opportunity compared to the non-BAME or the non-BIPOC population. So when you're thinking about financial inclusion, you're not only solving for the needs of the women, right, but you're also solving for the needs of many different types of population. So that's one angle that people can take, or benefits team or HR teams can take in solving. And how do you learn that, right? It's just keeping yourself aware, asking questions, right, asking feedback from your consultants, making sure that you have diverse perspectives, again, in the design process. And so what seems like a very simple, straightforward solution actually could be more powerfully positioned as effectuating change when it comes to inclusion.
Yeah. And what about things like, I automatically sort of pull into areas as well around engagement. So obviously different people engage with information, absorb information in different ways. So when you provide benefits, making sure that it's palatable and understood by everyone, that's one side of it. And the other side of it, I guess, is another side of it, is things like terminology in the business as well. What sort of what tips do you have for businesses that are, I suppose, you start off with this ambition of making sure that you have the right terminology in house, and that's quite a challenge, right?
Yeah.
I mean, where do you even start with that?
Yeah. Now you're getting into the space. I love that point, because it's now we're getting into the space of accessibility and communication.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter if you have
The best
programs if people are not understanding it and don't know how to access it or how to make sense of the information. So from a inclusion standpoint and diversity standpoint, thinking about the tactical stuff around, like, what's the grading level of the tone of our comms materials, right? You want it to be at around, I think, 5th grade level, to make it as easy to absorb as possible, right? And then when it comes to communication, it's also allowing for multiple points of entry, and I don't think many organizations do this well.
No.
Right? Because people have different learning styles, right?
Totally.
So this is actually a tip that I got from a good friend of mine who's an educator. So in his lesson planning, he has a section on, watch this YouTube video, and after you watch this, you will have understood XYZ. If you want to further increase your understanding, read this one-pager, right? After that, you know, here's a platform where you could do deeper trainings. So it's building block by block different ways that you could communicate and relay information. But the reality is it also allows for different modalities from which people learn and absorb information. So I think it's really, it's fundamental that the teams think about that.
Yeah.
In terms of access as well. So far as well, even from my conceptualization in my mind as we're talking, I'm thinking of white collar office workers, right?
Yeah.
So how do you actually communicate to those who are in manufacturing or plants? I worked for a bit for a pharma company, and we would go to the manufacturing site, and it's face to face, it's kiosk, it's finding that one person who could influence the peer group, right? The social circles. And so, think of the different settings as well as you solve for the needs of your population. Language is another thing. If you're a multinational, there are countries where you have to hit the language requirement, whether it's statutory or truly the cultural norm. So what comes to mind are Japan and French Canadians as well. And so,
on the statutory side, you mean? Yeah. On the statutory side, you mean?
Exactly. Yeah. So you got to get that right? And sometimes the point of view, at least that I've seen from multinationals in the States, is, you know, we are a language is expected, English language is expected as a means to do business, right? But if it's getting in the way of communicating things that really matter, that you work hard to design, then consider. And again, this is where things like AI gets exciting, because you potentially could do that quite, you know, maybe more easily than that we've been able to do in the past.
Absolutely.
It's actually on the point of like AI and things. Are you guys playing around with that currently at the moment, or anything like applying it? How anything that's been interesting? Or,
So Block has Goose. You know, it's our AI system. So we use that internally and think of ways that we can integrate that into informing our work, but also thinking about which elements are AI, but also being intentional around AI and automation are different things as well. It's so easy to throw the AI pasta across the room. So fundamentally just the beginning stages of what would that look like from not only a process standpoint, but from an experience standpoint. And how do you pull those resources? But as you could imagine, it's an undertaking, right? Because if your information, your data, your planned documents are not current, then you're just creating a tool that doesn't provide good information, right?
I think it's one of the things a lot of people underestimate a lot of times as well, is like, you know, the system, AI will only be as good as the information that you put in there, right? The reality is, like, in a lot in a lot of companies, they just don't have the details, right?
So would you trust AI at the moment? If you chucked in a policy and asked AI, is this in line with our DE&I policies, and you put them in there as well, would you trust AI at the moment to kick out anything worthwhile?
Not yet.
Okay.
However, it's in stages, right? Get the info right. Get it planted into your systems. For the purpose of, so you have to determine, like, what are you solving for each stage. To me it's a stage gate process. So the first process is, the fact-based questions can be answered by AI, right?
Yeah.
Then in stage 2, to me, how I would execute it is I would work with our inclusion team and diversity team to say, what sorts of questions are coming up from the community, right? Where we could then train the machine to be able to speak to these types of needs, right? And have a conversation around it. And then how do we overlay our own expertise around examining the range of things that we offer and positioning that as specifically, potentially programs and design or components or features that connect to a specific diverse need. So I think that's a good 2.0 through. So I think you just gave me my some of my own OKRs for the next 12 months or so.
Yeah, you boss better not hear this. Otherwise. I guess before we kind of coming up on time here, like anything else that you would want to say around inclusive benefits design, how you think organizations should do it, think about it differently. Yeah, anything else that you want to leave the listener with, I guess?
It's not necessarily doing more, it's doing things differently. The moment that you approach this from a checklist standpoint, to me, you're a shopper. Yeah. You're not a strategist. You're not thinking of ways that you're not helping the cause if you do it that way. And you're missing fundamental opportunity of how we should really be thinking about diverse and inclusive design. It should be built into the way we do things. It's not a supplemental thing, right? It should all be integrated within how we think about benefits. I cannot really emphasize enough the need to just go straight to the source, right? It's open source. It's built from the ground up, because then you optimize a lot of your efforts and your energy, right? When we talked about intersections earlier as well, it's easy to look at a person and make assumptions around these are their needs, right? But people are multidimensional, and to me, that's what intersection is about. So I'll share a little bit of my social work training, right? In social work, social work 101, you'll come across this notion of the feminization and juvenilization of poverty, which is just a complicated way of saying women and children are disproportionately affected by poverty, right? But then you also know that immigrants, communities of color face the same, right? So the moment that you start thinking about the cross-section of the different types of identity, women of color would then be, instead of just seeing one thing or another, it's a more complex area, right? It's also the same with urban versus rural poverty, right? And often we think of, maybe based on where we come from, we think of what that would look like. So when you talk to the communities directly and to the employees directly, you defy all of those assumptions, and you can challenge yourselves. It's all how we furnished our own world, right? And so how do we go beyond that? The second element is, again, go beyond benchmarks, right? Or use benchmark for what it is, right? To give you a sense check, but don't let benchmarks be the guiding light and the North Star. And then speaking of North Star, it's identifying your first principles, right? Is it accessibility? Is it equitable design? Asking questions around what is our play or our angle around, if we know that XYZ doesn't exist in ABC country, what is our responsibility to solve for that? And how does that connect to the business need, right? Yeah. And then how do you get really good at, and one of the things that I'm helping to think about right now is, at work, at any organization, there are always going to be a set of known unknowns and unknown unknowns. So given that, how do we come up with an approach to designing our programs and policies that can be resilient and agile to those known unknowns and unknown unknowns when they show up, right? So I think that's really important, especially as you're building the business case around pursuing these types of benefits. Partnering with really innovative solutions as well, right? As much as I love my training at Mercer and Aon, maybe this will resonate with people that are listening. It's more or less sometimes it's giving same type of recommendations, right? It's rather than actually seeing, well, who are the new players, right? But again, when you do that, it's just, you have to be mindful of the trade-offs, right? You might not be able to scale, they might be new. So exploring things like pilot programming is one way to do that. The last thing that I'll mention is you have to be super mindful as well on what areas you want to innovate versus not.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get so excited about radical innovation when maybe the situation needs no innovation or maybe incremental innovation. And so that helps really focus and prioritize what it is that you're trying to do, provided that you also have an understanding of what it is that you're solving for.
Picking your battles and figuring out where you have the most impact.
Yeah, exactly.
So Lee, if you had to close with like some practical advice, right? Obviously, we talked a lot about designing inclusive benefit packages and things. Like, what are some things that you would recommend that the listener sort of go through or think through as they're trying to implement these types of programs?
Yeah, gosh, so many. The first thing that comes to mind is being with the right partners. So in your request for proposals, ask the questions that speak to their ability to respond to diverse needs, right? So I've seen this happen in spaces like Canada, where some insurances don't have gender affirmation as a feature that you can add, right? So that could be a deal breaker in terms of your selection. So, but again, you have to have the awareness of what those things are, right? And this goes back to our point earlier around talking to the community and getting feedback, et cetera. So make that a criteria in your selection process. And then it's not only about the benefits design themselves, but it's also things like, well, what is the composition of your board, right? Or your leadership teams and your staff, right? And what are the different language competencies of your customer support teams? Those all feed into inclusion and diversity from a customer experience standpoint. And we all know the relationship already of diverse boards, or maybe we may be familiar with the relationships of diverse boards and diverse leaderships and how that play out in product design and customer experience, et cetera, right? There are also elements where you could be super creative with time off and leave policies. One example that has come up in my tenure so far is different religious holidays that are really difficult to plan for in terms of scaling and putting them into your holiday calendars or leave calendars. So the way I would solve for that is creating floating holidays that people can use. That's actually a recommendation straight from an interfaith community. So what I love about that is everyone gets to benefit from a floating holiday, right? So earlier we spoke about intersectionality and how do you solve for intersections of needs, and the more groups of people you can benefit, the more impactful it is from a business standpoint. So a floating holiday can be used by an individual for well-being, right? For running errands, for caretaking responsibilities, for religious holidays. And floating holidays, by and large, you need to check with your legal counsel, right? If that becomes a payable thing at the point of termination, because that's usually a consideration when you're designing leave policies. So that comes to mind. When you look at mental health, for example, and you're looking for an employee assistance provider, or EAP as we call it, asking them what is your tech system like, and the ability to curate your recommendations for coaches or therapists, right? Because, and I know this from my social work background, what makes a successful relationship with a provider, or a coach, or a therapist is goodness of fit. So if you have a system that people can select the different requirements and different needs, and then it only provides you the practitioners or providers that meet those needs, it's quite powerful in terms of the ability to have that better match, or it enhances the ability to match better with a provider, therefore leading to potentially, hopefully, a better clinical outcomes, right?
Well, you can even take that into primary care and like virtual GP appointments, right? People have, a lot of them are pretty good at this, I think, where they can, you can select whether you want a male or a female. And because I guess like if you're not able to select, people might not be willing to share certain information with certain people, right? So I guess it spins into that, is that primary care as well.
Yeah. So in any of your providers, right? The moment that you can select.
How can they customize the service according to the individual's needs? Yeah,
absolutely. Another thing that comes to mind is definitions, right? How we define family is quite traditional. So how we define a spouse, right? It should be gender neutral. It should be, and when it's gender neutral, it's inclusive. It assumes that it's not all same It's not all a male and female relationship. It's accounting for different types of relationships and same-sex relationships, for example. Domestic partnerships, could be a broader definition as well. And then how do you afford that same level of coverage? You could negotiate that in your contracts, right? Now, there might be some nuanced stuff around like benefits in kind taxation, all that jazz. That's something to be solved for. That's a consideration that shouldn't be a driver to stop you from exploring something, right? Because again, that's another pitfall. It's assuming that it's more complicated administratively. It's like, well, pick your battles. Do you want to be an inclusive employer or not, right? And so speaking of family, a really pertinent example here is when you think about designing bereavement leaves, right? Or caretaking leaves. If you have employees who are of transgender background, many of them get kicked out of their homes at a young age as they were pursuing their identity that's more true to themselves. And so they have, what the communities call chosen families or found families. So recognizing that that's a type of family that people need to care for or need to take time off for as well is really powerful. Yeah. And what it is too is it's challenging to come up with all of these iterations and versions, right? So there's a fundamental question that I want everyone to ask. How could I, when I have a policy or when I'm communicating something, what assumptions do I have? And again, if you have access to like ChatGPT Enterprise, this is a really good, sure, ChatGPT has its own biases, et cetera, but it gives you a platform to explore, to sense check. And so when you do that, then you're creating opportunities, not necessarily to like pinpoint all of the nuanced things around identities and diverse identities, but you potentially could get closer to a program design or a communication material that potentially speaks to or allows for people to see themselves in the material, right? Because the reality is we're not going to know all types of identities and how do we integrate that into our design. Yeah. But if we can recognize in our comms materials that as simple as, have you got other forms of family that's not recognized in this bullet point list? Reach out to us and we'll find a way. Right? Again, you may not have known that there's an idea of chosen family, but you recognize that it's possible that people have different types of families. And I would argue that if you're an employee that needs that, that's quite a powerful message, right? And it makes you like
sense of belonging, right?
being at work, right? Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I think with that, we'll get into the last part of the agenda here, which is our rewards confession.
Oh yeah.
We like asking this question of, is there a benefits project or something that when you look back on, you think even like, hey, what was I doing? Any confessions to make?
I told you all earlier that I developed this specific thing when I was in consulting of M&As, spin outs. And part of that exercise is benefits harmonization. Yeah. So then when I went in-house, that's the approach that my team and I would take. And sometimes you spend so much time trying to make the benefits be the same. And then it gets really tricky if the acquiring company has a lower design than the acquired company or the target company. Yeah. When I look back at that, gosh, I'm like, all of that energy could have been spent to think about ways that you could transition them into day one, and then thinking and conceptualizing ways that they could be designed for the future, right? You don't need to be the same, like the target companies or the acquiring companies. It could be an opportunity to actually think, oh, this could be our turning point.
Yeah, the case for change, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So that's one that comes up, or that came to me when I think about this particular question. The other bit is, I noticed amongst tech companies in my early days, and this really confused me because I thought, it couldn't have been the case, right? Sometimes the conversation veers into when you're talking about policies and design and program design, policy design, into what tech stack you have and what the tech solution can do. Mm-hmm. And so it gave system informs the policy rather than it being a consideration. Let's look at this design and then let's examine the feasibility of it. Yeah. Now, I think that's quite common amongst tech companies because of the engineering influence, right? So certainly that was an aha moment for me. And then I thought, well, they're so good at what they do, they can't be wrong, right? And maybe I'm wrong. So it's changing the way we think about things and the paradigm. And again, this is why it's essential that you have teams with different backgrounds that could bring into that conversation.
Amazing.
Great. Thanks so much, Lee.
Thank you. Thank you for listening, everyone. And thank you, Lee. Please do go online and subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcast, and Spotify. We'll see you next time.